Hey everybody, this is a piece from Hal Draper, Socialism from Below. The piece is titled Karl Marx and Simón Bolívar. Karl Marx and Simón Bolívar, a note on authoritarian leadership and a national liberation movement. Section 1. Contemporary politics is familiar with the moot issue of the justification for authoritarian dictatorships in developing countries, where the economic and political backwardness of the people and society is taken to prove the undesirability of democratic institutions for popular control from below. Generally speaking, there are two schools of apologia, one defending only those authoritarian regimes that orient toward dependence on American power and that protect foreign capital investments with adequate enthusiasm, and the other vindicating only those dictatorships that replace the old property-holding classes with a new class of bureaucratic collectivist rulers, or seem to be on the way to do so. While the first type of dictatorship automatically becomes a member of the free world, in Washington's slang, the latter type may adopt a sobriquet like, quote, communism or, quote, African socialism, end quote, etc., with appropriate references to a hyphenated or unhyphenated Marxism. The subject of this study is not the line of argument used to justify, quote, progressive authoritarianisms today, but only the relation of Marx's views to this question, since his name is so often taken in vain. It is true Marx did not have an opportunity to express an opinion on the regimes of Castro, Nkrumah, Mao, Nasser, and their similars, but as it happens, Marx took up a case which would seem to be a far less disputable example of a, quote, progressive authoritarian who led a great national liberation movement. This was Simón Bolívar, the, quote, liberator of northern South Africa. South Africa, Jesus Christ. South America. South America. The case is sharpened by the fact that Marx does not question the progressiveness and legitimacy of that national independence movement itself, and by the fact that, over a century ago, justification by backwardness had a better prima facie case than in the modern world, which on an international scale is rotten right for socialism from the Marxist point of view. There is no suggestion that the case is closed by putting Marx's views in evidence. The aim is only to establish the facts in Marx's case, since they have been disputed, as we shall see. We shall also see that Marx's views, controversial over a century ago, were just as controversial only a few years ago, when they once more became involved in a large-scale historical hassle in Latin America over Bolívar. It is not only a matter of Bolívar. It is strange that there are, quote, Marxists today who think that support to modernizing dictatorships is a new and fresh idea for socialists dating from about the end of World War II. In point of fact, the socialist movement began with the concept of the, quote, educational dictatorship, end quote, as I have discussed elsewhere, and nothing could be more natural. There were social struggles in undeveloped countries in Marx's day, too. After all, more countries were undeveloped. Indeed, the first underdeveloped countries with which Marx dealt historically were not other than England, France, and Germany, taken when they were faced with initial tasks of industrializing under an exploiting ruling class which was yet willy-nilly performing a certain historical role. The most passionate pages in Marx are reserved for denouncing the oppressive forms of capitalist rule in the Industrial Revolution. The political form which often clothed the modernizing function of the bourgeois new class in underdeveloped France was Bonapartism, and there is no political force which Marx spent more time excoriating. Still, the case of Bolívar more clearly brings out the then and now symmetry of the underlying problem. True, Marx viewed Bolívar as a case of Bonapartism, but there was a Bonapartism which did not arise after a Thermidor. But here was a Bonapartism which did not arise after a Thermidor, and still less after a whole historical interval like the Third Bonaparte. Rather, it was integrally involved in the leadership of the ongoing national liberation movement itself, as in several modern cases. Let us first establish Marx's views on Bolivar. Section 2. That Marx looked into Bolivar at all was something of an accident. In 1857, Charles Dana, D-A-N-A, managing editor of the New York Tribune, to which Marx had been contributing since 1851, asked Marx to collaborate on the projected New American Encyclopedia, mainly on matters of military history, biography, and terminology. Footnote. The New American Encyclopedia was edited by George Ripley and Charles A. Dana, in 16 volumes between 1858 and 1863. Dana, greatly impressed by the brilliance of the military affairs articles sent in by Marx, though actually written by Engels, excluded Marx from writing on more controversial subjects for the New American Encyclopedia because he wanted a bland, objective, and impartial tone, and he did not expect Marx to do this successfully on more ideological subjects. The detailed story of Marx's relation to the New American Encyclopedia is included in the introduction to my edition of Marx Engels' collected articles in the New American Encyclopedia. End footnote. Among the generals beginning with the letter B on Dana's list was, for example, Bernadotte, whose biography was half military, half political, and it was a military leader, no doubt, that Bolivar's name got into this list. Since Engels, ghostwriting for Marx, was already overburdened with the strictly military articles, Marx undertook Bolivar himself. Up to this time, there had been no mention of Bolivar in any of Marx's writings or correspondence. Therefore, no indication had ever given Bolivar a thought before he started doing research for the article in the British Museum. We know from the Marx-Engels correspondence on the Encyclopedia work that Marx typically started with the articles in the various encyclopedias, English language, French, and German at least. Marx came out of this research with a powerful reaction of political hostility against Bolivar. This comes through plainly in the Encyclopedia article, even though it was supposed to be couched in colorlessly impartial language. As was often true with Marx, political hostility also engendered an element of personal hostility, and he injected into the article a systematic disparagement of Bolivar's personal character and abilities taken over from his anti-Bolivar sources. We must stress that Marx's article on Bolivar is neither reliable nor important for any information it contains on the subject, about whom there is today much more material available. It is of great interest only for what it tells us about Marx. As Marx reacts politically to what he reads about Bolivar. To be sure, there is an interplay between Marx's reaction and certain facts about Bolivar, which we will explore, but the governing aim is to understand Marx. It is unrewarding to try to correct Marx's extremely overdrawn depreciation of Bolivar's military talents and activities, etc. The article has many biographical details wrong. Footnote, including the subject's name, which appears as, quote, Bolivar y Ponte. Marx obviously did not understand the Spanish surname. Bolivar y Ponte was the name of the subject's father, but his own was Simón Bolívar y Palacios. Even in 1963, the editors of the Marx-Engels Werke, Volume 29, repeat Marx's mistake in their name index. End footnote. But since the source of all this was Marx's political evaluation, we are going to concentrate exclusively on the attack against Bolivar as an authoritarian and Bonapartist. Marx's article on the, quote, Liberator, end quote, the quotation marks are Marx's too, first establishes his class background, quote, the criollo nobility in Venezuela, end quote, of which his family was one of the wealthiest. We are told of Bolivar's second visit to Europe, where Bolivar, quote, was present at Napoleon's coronation as emperor in 1804 and at his assumption of the Iron Crown of Lombardy in 1805, end quote. After an account of Bolivar's early career in the War of Independence, Marx writes, quote, having proclaimed himself, quote, dictator and liberator of the western provinces of Venezuela, end quote, Bolivar created, quote, the Order of the Liberator, end quote, established a choice, parenthesis, i.e. elite, end parenthesis, corps of troops under the name of his bodyguard, and surrounded himself with the show of a court, end quote. But, quote, Bolivar's dictatorship soon proved a military anarchy, leaving the most important affairs in the hands of favorites who squandered the finances of the country and then resorted to odious means in order to restore them, end quote. A little later, Marx describes one of the charades common in Bolivar's career, in which the general refuses to continue as dictator but finally, quote, yields to insistent supporters, quote, the dictatorship was thus invested with some sort of legal sanction, end quote. He continues to refer to Bolivar as a dictator through the ensuing narration of military events, noting carefully his demand at the 1816 meeting of his staff just before renewing the war for, quote, uniting the civil war and military power in his person, end quote. And, just as carefully, the desire of other independence leaders to confide the civil power to a representative assembly instead, in spite of his promise, as Marx relates, quote, to assemble a Congress and not meddle with the civil administration, end quote. When he entered Barcelona, quote, he proclaimed, martial law and the union of all powers in his single person, end quote. When Marx tells of Bolivar's blood purge of his rival, General Piar, one of the blackest incidents of Bolivar's career, Marx mentions that Piar called Bolivar a, quote, Napoleon of the retreat, end quote. Marx writes that when the National Congress of February 1819 was called, quote, the mere name of the Congress proved powerful enough to create a new army, end quote, thereby contrasting the popular mobilizing appeal of the representative institution against the dampening effects of Bolivar's dictatorial methods. He continues to concentrate on Bolivar's authoritarian role as opportunity presents itself. The Angostura Congress, he recounts, ousted Bolivar's man Zea, and, quote, on receiving this news, Bolivar suddenly marched his foreign legion towards Angostura and restored Zea to his dignities. Dr. Rocha, fascinating him with the prospects of centralized power, led him to proclaim the, quote, Republic of Colombia, end quote, end quote. The Cucuta Congress of 1821 met and, quote, after Bolivar had again pretended to resign, renewed his powers, end quote, quote, through his Colombian bodyguard, he swayed the votes of the Congress of Lima, which, February 10, 1823, transferred to him the dictatorship, while he secured his re-election as president of Colombia by a new tender of resignation, end quote. Then the Republic of Bolivia was set up, quote, here, where his general, Sucre's, bayonets were supreme, Bolivar gave full scope to his propensities for arbitrary power by introducing the, quote, Bolivian Code, end quote, an imitation of the Code Napoleon. It was his plan to transplant that code from Bolivia to Peru and from Peru to Colombia, to keep the former states in check by Colombian troops and the latter by the Foreign Legion and Peruvian soldiers. By force, mingled with intrigue, he succeeded indeed, for some weeks at least, in fastening his code upon Peru, end quote. But in Colombia, a struggle broke out, quote, between the centralist or Bolivarists and the federalists, under which the latter name latter named the enemies of military anarchy, i.e. Bolivar's dictatorship, had coalesced with military rivals, end quote. Bolivar used, quote, a pretext for overthrowing the Colombian constitution and resuming the dictatorship, end quote. The 1827 Congress of Panama had, quote, ostensible object, had the 1827 Congress of Panama had, quote, ostensible object of establishing a new democratic international code, end quote. But, quote, what he really aimed at was the erection of the whole of South America into one federative republic, with Bolivar himself as its dictator, end quote. But his power was slipping, quote, the Congress of Osaña, convoked by Bolivar with a view to modify the constitution in favor of Bolivar's arbitrary power, was opened the 2nd of March, 1828, by an elaborate address, insisting on the necessity of new privileges for the executive, end quote. But Bolivar's opponents walked out, quote, under the pressure of Bolivar's bayonets, popular assemblies, anew invested Bolivar with dictatorial power, end quote. An assassination attempt, quote, allowed Bolivar for some time to introduce a sort of military terrorism. Bolivar did not, however, lay hands on Santander, although he had participated in the conspiracy, while he put to death General Padilla, whose guilt was not proved at all, but who, as a man of color, was not able to resist, end quote. Marx. The rest is a brief summary of Bolivar's loss of power and death in 1830. One second. All right. Section 3. Considering that the article was supposed to be bland and nonpartisan, Marx was clearly presenting an extremely hostile view of Bolivar's authoritarianism by means of selection and emphasis. Through all this, the progressiveness of the struggle for independence itself is not only unquestioned but confidently assumed. The criticism of Bolivar is always fully within the framework of the view that Bolivar's policy weakened the independence struggle. We have already seen this when Marx contrasted the popular appeal of the Revolutionary Congress to the negative aspects of Bolivar's dictatorship. In another place, Marx explains that, quote, the further they, Bolivar's forces, advanced, the stronger grew their resources, the cruel excesses of the Spanish acting everywhere as the recruiting sergeants for the Army of Independence, end quote. Marx speaks of, quote, the new enthusiasm of the people, end quote, over independence, which, quote, turned to dissatisfaction, end quote, on account of Bolivar's dictatorship, thus allowing the Spanish to recover. This is the picture at many points in the article. It takes for given the liberation of the Negro slaves as one of the revolutionary forces, though Bolivar is not given this portion of given Bolivar's portion of the credit. We may add that another of the New American Encyclopedia. Where the hell is it? New American Encyclopedia. Where the hell am I? We may add that another of the New American Encyclopedia articles is, quote, Aya Sucho, written by Marx and Engels in collaboration, which portrays this decisive battle as a triumph for the independence forces, quote, thus the Spanish dominion was definitely destroyed, end quote, etc. Thus, for Marx, Bolivar's Bonapartism is counterposed to the interests of the revolution. The issue is clearly not the national struggle, but Bolivar's political role in the national struggle. This is the only one of the Marx-Engels articles for the new American Encyclopedia, which editor Dana questioned. Because of its anti-Bolivar leanings, Marx told Engels in a letter of 14th of February 1858, quote, "With regard to a rather long article on Bolivar, Dana furthermore expressed misgivings because it is written in a partisan style, and Dana asks for my authorities. Of course, I can give them to Dana, though it is a peculiar demand. As for the partisan style, I did somewhat drop the encyclopedic tone, to be sure. To see the most cowardly, mean, and wretched scoundrel decried as Napoleon I was somewhat too absurd. Bolivar is a true soliqueux," end quote. Marx. Letter to Engels, February 14th, 1858. Quote, "Soliqueux," end quote, is only nominally a reference to the Haitian emperor. Marx and other anti-Bonapartists commonly used soliqueux as a sobriquet for the third Napoleon. It summarizes Marx's view of Bolivar as a type of Bonapartist dictator. Marx's article in Bolivar remained virtually unknown until it was republished for the first time, albeit in Russian translation, in the Marx-Engels Sochenia. Sochenia. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Volume 2, Part 2, 1934. In 1937, it was included in the Communist published collection, Revolution in Spain, which also appeared in Spanish as La Revolución Española. There was no editorial comment on Marx's viewpoint. As late as 1951, when the U.S. Communist Party chief, William Z. Foster, published his Outline of Political History of the Americas, Marx's article was quoted favorably. But this turned out to be the, quote, wrong line, end quote, on Latin American history. When the second edition of the Sochenia or Zochenia, I don't know. Zochenia was published, Volume 14, 1959, carried a sharp attack on Marx's article, which was also faithfully translated in the East German Marx-Engels Werke, Volume 14, 1961. The attack by the communist editors is couched in the usual terms of, quote, excusing, end quote, Marx for not knowing any better in his day. It decries Marx's sources as untrustworthy, which they were indeed, and includes in this decrial also any conception of Bolivar as a, quote, dictator, end quote. Its claims for Bolivar as a, quote, progressive, end quote, include this, quote, Bolivar succeeded in binding together for a while in this struggle the patriotic element of the Creole landowners, the bourgeoisie, and the mass of people, including the Indians and Negroes, end quote. And it disposes of Marx as follows, quote, naturally, Marx had at that time no other sources at his disposal than the books of the authors mentioned, whose bias was then only little known. It was therefore inevitable that Marx got a one-sided view of Bolivar's personality, which was reflected in his essay. The striving of Bolivar's for personal power, which was exaggerated in the literature mentioned, could not remain without influence on Marx's attitude toward Bolivar, end quote. The editors of German Marx-Engels Werke, Volume 14, 1961. The key claim that, quote, naturally Marx had at that time no other sources at his disposal, end quote, than the anti-Bolivar books Marx cited, is intended to suggest that Marx's view of Bolivar was merely the result of misinformation rather than of political opinion. Even if one grants that Marx innocently accepted the, quote, misinformation, end quote, this does not change the political meaning of his reaction to this, quote, misinformation, end quote. If you react to the news that the U.S. has dropped an H-bomb on Peking by denouncing Washington, then this is an indicator of your political views, even if it turns out later that the news was misinformation. Marx reacted to his image of Bolivar with a kind of political attack which nowadays is ridiculed not only by communist realpolitiker, but also by a legion of bourgeois, quote, realists who agree that undeveloped nations need dictators. The conclusion is inescapable that Marx put a human value on democratic freedom, which is alien to both of these varieties of, quote, realism, end quote. As a matter of fact, the communist editor's claim is quite false. It is not true that, quote, Marx had no other sources at his disposal, end quote, etc. It is not true that an anti-Bolivar attitude was prevalent and accepted when Marx wrote his article. We have already mentioned that in working on the NAC articles, Marx went through the extant encyclopedias, French, German, and English language. The articles which he read in these encyclopedias were overwhelmingly pro-Bolivar, mainly uncritically so. This can be checked with little trouble in the then current editions of the Encyclopedia Americana, the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Penny Encyclopedia, the Encyclopédie du 19 siècle, I don't know how to say siècle, 19th century in French, the Dictionnaire de la Conversation, the Brackhouse Conversations Lexicon. For all 4 centuries represented here, the picture is unequivocal. It was Marx's article that was out of step, and that is exactly why Dana questioned it apprehensively. As for the communist editors' claim that modern scholarship disposes of Marx's view of Bolivar's political role, and that Marx, quote, exaggerated, end quote, Bolivar's striving for personal power, a discussion of the state of modern scholarship on Bolivar's dictatorial ambitions is not possible in this article. It is a thorny subject. On the one hand, there is the standard hagiography of Bolivarolatry of most Latin American writings on the subject. On the other hand, the polar opposite view is now represented most prominently by Salvador de Madariaga's devastating job Bolivar, whose impact was fatally weakened by its essentially pro-Spanish slant to the point of drawing attention away from its massive documentation. The result was an anti-Madariaga fur, which we cannot here untangle. However, if we limit ourselves to the single question of Bolivar's authoritarianism, the picture is not quite so complicated. The numerous and violent denunciations of Madariaga have had little to say on the facts in this respect, preferring either to ignore them or to justify them with fairly common varieties of anti-democratic argumentation. In the light of Madariaga's factual structure, Marx's attack on Bolivar's dictatorial politics suffered only from mildness. In light of Madariaga's factual structure, Marx's attack on Bolivar's dictatorial politics suffered only from mildness. But because of the guerre à muerte around Madariaga, the next section is not based on his work, but on the work which has gained the widest acceptance in Latin Americanist, not Latin American, circles. Gerhard Messur's Simón Bolívar. Gerhard Messur's book is not and does not pretend to be impartial. Gerhard Messur's Simón Bolívar is frankly pro-Bolivar, often openly slanted. Gerhard Messur's frequently surrounds disagreeable facts about Bolivar's authoritarianism with passionate argumentation to justify Bolivar's authoritarianism. But the point is that Gerhard Messur presents many of the facts. Section 4. Bolivar's politics must be viewed in 2 periods, before and after the final military victory in 1825, not because there was really a qualitative change, but only because of the nature of the rationalizations. As long as the fighting was going on, Bolivar's dictatorship could be defended as a military necessity, though it was not. After victory, this apologia is not available. Hence, the existence of the viewpoint, which was embodied in the communist editor's attack on Marx, that Bolivar became objectionably authoritarian only in his last years. Bolivar's first important political pronouncement was the 1812 Manifesto of Cartagena. The 1812 Manifesto of Cartagena marked Simón Bolívar's first clear demands for highly centralized, quote, strong, end quote, government. Quote, our compatriots, end quote, Bolívar said, quote, are not yet capable of exercising their legal rights, end quote. And, quote, government must prove to be formidable and ruthless without regard to law or constitution until peace is established, end quote. Simón Bolívar. That Simón Bolívar meant dictatorship was shown by the next year when Simón Bolívar's forces took Caracas and Bolívar openly assumed the dictator's role. In 1815, Simón Bolívar's, quote, letter from Jamaica strikes the same note on the impossibility of extending democratic rights to the people. Quote, as long as our fellow citizens do not acquire the talents and virtues which distinguish our brothers to the north, parenthesis, the U.S., end parenthesis, our radical democratic system, far from being good for us, will bring ruin upon us. Unfortunately, we do not possess these traits, ... end quote. At this time, Bolívar was thinking in terms of a hereditary senate composed of the wealthy families of the criollo upper classes, plural, with an elected lower chamber based on property qualifications for voting. At the 1819 Congress of Angostura, Bolívar, according to Gerhard Masur, already wanted, but did not openly propose, a lifetime presidency which would control all national power without responsibility to Congress or courts. Simón Bolívar's speech attacked, quote, absolute democracy, end quote, parenthesis, which meant democracy, end parenthesis. And Gerhard Masur remarks that, quote, Bolívar's concepts of state were closer to those of Napoleon than to the men of the terror, end quote. In fact, quote, Bolívar's ideas approximate those of Napoleon and anticipate something of the fascist system, end quote. Gerhard Masur. Bolívar thought in terms of an elite class, quote, irreconcilable with democratic principles, end quote. And Gerhard Masur points out, parenthesis, what is obvious enough, end parenthesis, that to this day South America is ruled by such an elite oligarchy of wealth. In 1812, the Congress of Cucuta adopted a constitution too democratic for Bolívar's taste. It is, quote, Colombia's death knell, end quote, Simón Bolívar complained. Simón Bolívar blamed the, quote, lawyers and ideologists, end quote. Quote, in the end, end quote, Simón Bolívar wrote, quote, the literati will do so much that they will be outlawed by the Colombia Republic as Plato outlawed the poet of his republic. These gentlemen think that their opinion is the will of the people, without realizing that in Colombia, the people are in the army, ... end quote. Parenthesis, a false statement if taken at face value, the army being very small. What Bolívar meant was that the people who counted were the military, end parenthesis. As for others, quote, their only right is to remain passive citizens, end quote, Bolívar wrote, and again denounced people who wanted a republic like that in the north. Bolívar's opportunity to insist on dictatorship came with military success. In 1822, after Guayaquil, he deliberately encouraged, quote, anarchy and confusion, end quote, says Gerhard Masur, so that he might declare himself dictator of the province to save it from anarchy and confusion. He next aimed to be invested as dictator of Colombia. First, he demanded an all-powerful presidency for himself. Quote, I am convinced, end quote, Bolívar wrote, quote, that Colombia can only be kept in order and well-being by absolute power, end quote. While bitter resistance in Colombia kept him from achieving his goal, he did become dictator of Peru after victory there in 1823. When peace came after the Battle of Ayacucho at the end of 1825, Bolívar did not reverse his field, but pressed more strongly than ever for an authoritarian regime in all the new republics. Bolívar's goal was committed to paper in the form of the Bolivian Constitution, which Bolívar wrote himself, and which to the end of his life, Bolívar proposed for adoption by all other countries singly and collectively, as well as by the projected, quote, Federation of the Andes, end quote. Bolívar's longed for empire. Quote, Bolívar's constitution, end quote, writes Monsieur, quote, restricts the people, as far as possible, from exercising any influence on government. It emulates Napoleon's consular government, end quote. Bolívar's constitution, quote, admits no form of self-government, end quote, Monsieur. Of the three legislative chambers, the censors are responsible for, quote, morals, end quote, and elected for life. The tribunes, parenthesis, administrative supervisors, end parenthesis, and senators, once elected by a complicated system, are never freely elected again. The citizens are permitted only to present candidates, from whom each chamber chooses its own successors. The, quote, son, end quote, of this system is the president, who is named for life and then appoints the president's own successor, the vice president, who is also the prime minister and hereditary. Gerhard Monsieur is moved to write that all this, quote, merely made Bolivia a monarchy without a monarch, with an elected kingship such as the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire possessed, end quote. Parenthesis, but the Pope does not designate his own successor, end parenthesis. Bolívar explained, quote, according to such a procedure, elections would be avoided, elections which are the greatest scourge of republics and which produce only anarchy, end quote. Gerhard Monsieur. Gerhard Monsieur adds, quote, the other parts of the Constitution do not need detailed analysis. Those paragraphs that deal with human rights are short and somewhat vague. Those concerning administration are traditional. Those which take up the administration of justice are open to question, end quote. Gerhard Monsieur. Colombia resisted imposition of the Bolivian system, so did Peru, but in August 1826, Bolívar imposed it there by force. Monsieur's heart is plainly sore at the telling. Quote, Bolívar was now accustomed to dictatorial power, end quote. In Peru, quote, Bolívar's position assumed the attributes and prerogatives of a sultanate, end quote. Gerhard Monsieur. We are reminded that, quote, Bolívar had said on many occasions that South America could be ruled by an astute despot, end quote. Gerhard Monsieur. To achieve Bolívar's end, Bolívar more and more allied Bolívar's self with reactionary clericalism to add the power of the church to the backing of the wealthy and the landed. 1 second, let me get a drink here. Protein shake, gonna get swole. Where am I? How and why Bolívar failed to achieve the personal dictatorship Bolívar sought, in spite of Bolívar's prestige as, quote, liberator, is another story. The nub of it is the fierce resistance of the mass of people to Bolívar's aims. By 1829, when Bolívar faced the issue of bullying through to power behind his Praetorian legions, Bolivar was already a physical wreck for quite different reasons, and he died the following year. In the light of these facts, Bolivar's drive for personal dictatorship was not in the least, quote, exaggerated, end quote, by Marx, contrary to the claim of the communist editors, nor has modern scholarship contradicted Marx's overall picture in this respect. On the contrary, all of the encyclopedia accounts of the period, which we mentioned, only Marx's corresponds with historical truth, as far as concerns the political issue we have been discussing. New section, Section 5. The facts are one thing, justificatory rationalizations another. To this day, more than a century after Marx registered his protest against Bolivar's anti-democratic views and goals, what other voice has been willing to make a basic criticism of this authoritarianism, or to counterpose faith in democratic institutions against the dictatorial leader of the independence movement? From the South American hagiographers who do touch on this issue, there are only the usual justifications. Enrique de Gandia offers a typical statement. The Bolivian constitution, autocratic to be sure, was, quote, a reflection of the monarchical ideas which were then held by Bolivar, San Martin, and the greater part of the sensible, bracket, sick, end bracket, people, end quote. But not by the overwhelming majority of the people, not even a century and a half ago. For over a decade, until the mythmakers turned Bolivar into a sun god, the masses execrated his name even after his death. For them, only Marx speaks even now. Quote, Bolivar, end quote, writes this apologist, Enrique de Gandia, quote, made a constitution in order to be able to govern energetically and tranquilly, end quote. Enrique de Gandia. So says every dictator. But the scheme for the lifetime president, hereditary vice president, and self-perpetuating legislature was a fantasy even in 1826. It could not have kept the people, quote, tranquil, end quote, except in their graves. Vicente Lesuna, the high priest of the Caracas cultists, has only this to say on our subject in Vicente Lesuna's attack on the Madariaga book. So on Madariaga's book. Quote, Sir Madariaga lacks political vision, or Senor Madariaga lacks political vision. Madariaga does not understand the grandeur of Bolivar's continental ideas for the formation of a great state. Parenthesis, not true of Madariaga, Hal Draper, end parenthesis. Nor the Bolivian constitution, which was conceived with the idea of giving political stability to Bolivar's creation, end quote. Vicente Lesuna. Stability above all was also the great vision of Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. A.F. Bryce is cruder. A.F. Bryce explains that, quote, democracy, end quote, does not require, quote, government of the people by the people, end quote, nor by a majority of the people, but only the, quote, active citizens, end quote, not necessarily under universal suffrage. This political principle is propounded for today, too. Carlton Beale's Eagle of the Andes, South American Struggles for Independence, published in 1963, pays little serious attention to political issues, but the final chapters do not neglect to explain that, quote, there was no basis for democratic or representative government, end quote. The same rationalization that the same author could make for Russia or Cuba today, and just as untrue. V.A. Belaun's Bolivar and the Political Thought of the Spanish-American Revolution, published in 1938, becomes critical at times of Bolivar's last period, but the summary in Belaun's preface is a straight-out eulogy of the, quote, originality, end quote, of Bolivar's, quote, program of organic, hierarchical, and technical democracy, end quote, parenthesis, undefined, end parenthesis, as against, quote, individualistic democracy, end quote. Belland calls it, quote, democratic Caesarism, end quote, which has a, quote, unique value, end quote, and that this, quote, democratic Caesarism, end quote, quote, liberates the political structure from the domination of the will of the individuals, end quote, in which respect, quote, Bolivar had an intuition of the real evil in pure democracy, ... end quote. V.A. Belland. We have already mentioned that Monsieur, while presenting a sufficiency of damning facts as a scholar, tries very hard to whitewash Bolivar's dictatorship. His preface even expresses agreement with the, quote, essence of Bolivar's political credo, end quote. Having made clear that the facts show Bolivar to be an authoritarian, Monsieur editorializes his hero into a, quote, authoritarian democrat, end quote. Like Belland, Monsieur labels the product, quote, democratic Caesarism, end quote. All of these terms are undefined. On the very next page, after he has himself said that Bolivar's ideas, quote, anticipate something of the fascist system, end quote, a stronger statement than any we would make, Monsieur still finds it possible to write, quote, he wanted a democracy, but a stable democracy, end quote. Parenthesis, there is nothing in Monsieur's book that shows Bolivar really wanting any kind of democracy, end parenthesis. On one page he writes, quote, his will was totalitarian, end quote, but, parenthesis, since he never got his will, end parenthesis, a couple of pages on he says, quote, his dictatorship should not be compared to or confused with the abuse of power that characterizes the totalitarian tyrants of our own day, end quote. Gerhard Monsieur. Which is true as far as it goes. Bolivar's aspirations were Bonapartist, as Marx saw, and one must not be anachronistic. Gerhard Monsieur's summary judgment is, quote, Bolivar remained dictator, but no one can doubt that this was the only possible solution at the time, end quote. A strange claim. Far from being the only possible solution, it is indisputable that Bolivar's dictatorship was no solution at all. Bolivar's dictatorship crashed ignominiously. The danger of, quote, anarchy, end quote, of which Gerhard Monsieur often speaks, Gerhard Monsieur's echoing Bolivar, resulted from the clash between the efforts of the ruling oligarchy to impose oppressive controls on the people and the struggle of the latter against this oppression. This, quote, anarchy should be avoided and the, quote, tranquility, end quote, of Gandia achieved. Only if the masses bent their necks without fighting back, what was the authoritarian's dream of law and order? Finally, what about the very model of a modern liberal, Salvador de Madariaga himself? We know, of course, that Madariaga takes pains to exhibit Bolivar's dictatorship, as Madariaga systematically takes apart the pretenses of the Bolivar cult. But he is for it, not against it. Madariaga makes clear more than once, Madariaga believes Bolivar to have been right in his ambitions. Quote, Bolivar did want a monocracy, and Bolivar was right, end quote. Madariaga writes in italics, quote, far from yielding to those demagogic notions which have led to compulsory suffrage and to the granting of the vote to the illiterate in Bolivar's own native land, Bolivar would divide citizens into active and passive, ... end quote. And, quote, had Congress listened to Bolivar and granted Bolivar his uncrowned kingship and even his hereditary senate, the new state would have begun its independent life under better auspices, end quote. Madariaga. In fact, Madariaga believes Bolivar was remiss only in not pushing boldly for an outright monarchy for himself! Exclamation point. Our Spanish liberals' view of the matter is just about the most openly reactionary of all those we have so far considered. The connection with his overall thesis is not hard to see, and Bolívar virtually makes it himself. Quote, "What Bolívar was driving at was the reconstruction of the Spanish Empire without the Spanish king," end quote. Madariaga. If this is so, then in Madariaga's eyes, why spill the blood of a continent in order to merely change a crowned monarch for an uncrowned monarch? Section 6. Thus Marx remains to this day one of the few champions of the democratic aspirations for which the northern South Americans fought against their, quote, liberator, end quote. Marx does not accept the rationalizations for dictatorship, which have not changed much in a century and a half. Footnote. But the biggest gap in Marx's article, in this article, and generally in the literature of Bolivarology, is the lack of attention to the class struggle within the South American camp against the Creole ruling oligarchy, which led to the revolution. Yet its greatest weight as a historical factor is plain from a multitude of facts in Gerhard Massur's and Madariaga's work, which remain unexplored, particularly the extreme smallness of the revolution's base among the lower classes and the Indians, who varied mainly from apathetic to pro-Spanish. Very suggestive is Juan Bosch's recent book, Bolívar y la Guerra Social, published in Buenos Aires in 1966, especially in putting Bolívar's drive for dictatorship into the context of ruling class interests. End footnote. We stated at the beginning that we are not here arguing the issue of authoritarianism itself, against those who would ridicule the very idea of counterposing a struggle for democratic rights to the, quote, realistic, end quote, dictatorship of Bolívar. But at least we can restate the issue as follows. In one corner is Massur's formulation of the justification for authoritarianism, which is already well known in Marx's day. Bolívar's dictatorship, says Gerhard Massur, was, quote, a dictatorship of training, intended to mature a people that was immature, end quote. This is the notion of the, quote, educational dictatorship, end quote, which was the most widely accepted idea of the early socialists and communists whom Marx combated. But nowhere in history do we know of a dictatorship which trained the masses to become, quote, mature, end quote, Democrats, except insofar as it, quote, trained, end quote, them to fight against it. I'm going to repeat that because there was a lot of italics in the last bit. But nowhere in history do we know of a dictatorship which trained the masses to become, quote, mature, end quote, Democrats, except insofar as that dictatorship, quote, trained, end quote, the masses to fight against the dictatorship. Just as there has never been an imperialist domination of a backward people which carried out through the well-advertised white man's burden of preparing the subjects for self-rule, except insofar as it stimulated the people to organize themselves for revolution. A people do not become, quote, trained, end quote, for democracy, nor do people, quote, mature, end quote, except by their own fight for democracy, against the powers that tell them it is, quote, training, end quote, them, and against the intellectual servitors who apologize for the dictatorship with these arguments. There seems to be a contradiction if there is no way for people to become, quote, ready, end quote, for democracy except by fighting for democracy. Then it follows they must begin fighting for democracy before they are certified to be, quote, ready. And in historical fact, this is the only way in which democracy is advanced in the world. The continuous solution to the contradiction lies in the process of revolution itself. This is a dialectic which will always be jeered at by those mentalities which know how to celebrate revolutionary struggles only after they have been straitjacketed by a new oppressive establishment. Again, this has been Hal Draper, Karl Marx and Simón Bolívar, This article was first published in New Politics in 1968. It was republished in Socialism from Below, which is a compilation of, or a compendium of Hal Draper's writings, edited by E. Haberkern. Thank you so much for listening.